as well. Now, let's get uncomfortable. Let's get very uncomfortable here on a Friday because there is a conversation to be had. And that conversation, as a flagship, a lot of stations can get tagged as you're homers, you're this, you're that. I think Chris Watkins and I do a really good job of not being homers, but you do want to be optimistic when you're dealing with a team like the Kings who haven't had a ton of success. It's too easy to be pessimistic, right? You don't need to be that contrarian. They're the contrarians for the Niners who are pessimists, when maybe that's a little bit different because you have so many people being optimists with the Niners. But with the Kings, it's a little bit different. But this is a day where we should at least have the conversation. Their over-under is set at 46.5. So it's not even necessarily about being a pessimist. It's simply about thinking that the outlets might be on to something. And what if the outlets are correct? What if the Sacramento Kings end at 46 wins, 47 wins, right? Another okay season, and they lose in the play-in again? What if they lose in the play-in again? And that would mean that De'Aaron Fox maybe had a season similar to this season. Malik Monk had a season similar to this season. Kevin Huerter couldn't find it. Keegan Murray still couldn't find that three ball. And DeMar DeRozan, he helped, but didn't help enough. How bad could this get if the Kings don't make the playoffs? Are we talking about a situation where there's some sort of blow up? And who would be on the chopping block in that situation? Again, we spend so much time saying, and let me caveat this by saying, I think the Kings are going to smash that 46.5. But the reality is, this is a possibility that they don't. I think the Kings are going to get close to 50 wins. They might get 50. But the reality is, there's literally a possibility that they don't. So let's just have the conversation. Out of all the days that we do say they're going to do this, they're going to do that, because even if they get 50 wins, are we talking about them in the second round? Do we think this team can make a finals run? But at least we would say, hey, they're moving in the right direction. So let's just have the conversation. 916-339-1140, chime in, and this could turn into, how confident are you that the Kings are going to make the playoffs? I believe getting DeMar DeRozan raised the floor of the Kings. The floor, prior to getting DeMar DeRozan, 9 seed, 10 seed, maybe worse than that. Getting DeMar DeRozan, that floor, to me, is about a 7 seed. I think in this way, I think a lot of things would have to go right for other teams, but I think the floor for this team is a 7 seed, right? That still puts you in the play-in. I think the ceiling for this team is probably, I don't know, 3, 4. You start looking at teams that have to drop out of the conversation. And I don't know how many teams are going to drop out of the conversation. I know the Clippers are. I feel like the Nuggets might, but I don't really have any reason to feel like that other than I'm just not that high on the Nuggets. And you have the other teams that are in front of them. I think the Suns got better. I think the Mavericks got better. So if this team doesn't make the playoffs, then what happens? Okay? You just extended Mike Brown. You just signed DeMar DeRozan. Assuming they don't make the playoffs, that would mean that De'Aaron Fox didn't make all NBA, so he won't get that Supermax. He can still get an extension. At that point, he probably accepts the extension. So you have Sabonis on the books. You have De'Aaron Fox on the books. You have Keegan Murray, I believe, would be very close to that extension, or it might be time for that extension. I'll have to double check. And you have some tough conversations that are going to need to be had if you don't make the playoffs. And it's crazy because losing in the first round, I don't necessarily know why the conversations would be that much tougher, but missing the playoffs, because either way, it still wasn't much of a run. But either way, if you don't make the playoffs, there will be some uncomfortable conversations. And the question becomes very similar to that expansion team conversation that we had a couple weeks ago. Oh, if there's an expansion team, you get to protect, 7, 8 players. Who's protected? If the Kings don't make the playoffs, who is off the table? Because I think you have to look at this thing in a completely different way. You have to look at this thing and think, okay, well, if we didn't make the playoffs, what is it that our system is doing is not happening correctly, right? Is it too much Domantas Sabonis? Is it De'Aaron Fox? Is he really a 2? Keegan Murray, okay, were they right? Were the naysayers right? Did DeMar DeRozan mess up his runway? And if we're going to keep DeMar, maybe we have to move off of Keegan. This thing could get a little dicey. There is so much riding on this season, in my opinion, which is why it's still, and I know Kyle Draper, I want to give a shout out to Kyle Draper because he has really stood strong in his John Collins take. That's not to say whether it's right or wrong. It's just the reality. He stood very strong in his John Collins take. And I'm going to be honest with you. We're a station where I would say on social media or whatever it is, we do things and it just kind of flies under the radar. Because now all of a sudden, Kyle Draper, who's been talking about John Collins all week long, okay, now I'm seeing pieces being written about John Collins. And not necessarily that he's rumored, but that it would be a good fit. No mention necessarily of Kyle Draper, but the conversation is, oh, maybe John Collins is a good fit. So I want to give a shout out to Kyle Draper, and don't tell him because I got a reputation. Don't tell him I said any of that. But if they don't make the playoffs, you're looking at a situation where this thing could get very, very dicey. There is so much, Kyle, riding on this season. And I don't know if I'm overblowing this, but to me, if you don't make the playoffs again, I don't know if anything is off the table. I think you want to make the right decision, but I think everything is on the table if you do not make the playoffs this season.
I think the context for how we get there is going to matter a lot because if you thought the West was deep last year, and granted, injuries might happen again, but if the West was deep last year, we're going 13 deep this year. The only two teams I know are definitively out of the running are Utah and Portland. San Antonio, I don't know if they'll get to the top 8 this year, but it's at least on the table. The Memphis Grizzlies are bringing back Ja Morant, and their catastrophic amount of injuries last year. That's a team that's going to get into that group that the Kings were in last year, I would imagine. And if you aren't one of those top 4 teams, it really is anything could happen, because what's going to end up happening with a lot of these teams is that they are all going to start beating each other up when they play throughout the season. And I know 46.5 seems like a number the Kings should blow past. And I think they were 6th or 7th best in the Western Conference in terms of win totals, which kind of gives you an idea of about where the standings are going to be. But when these teams start beating each other up, man, it's all going to get lumped together again. And 5, again, you said the Nuggets will probably take a step back. I agree. I don't know if that's all the way back to play-in territory, but they should take a step back. The Suns should take a step back. The rest of these teams are kind of doing what they can within the margins. I don't think Houston has done anything to significantly improve from where they were last year. So I think they're probably going to be in that same 10, 11, 12 range. But there's a lot of different teams that are doing different things to try and get out of this cluster between 6 and 12 or 6 and 13 that the Kings were in last year. And by chance, the Kings could be back in this year. It's certainly not off the table, because I don't think even adding DeMar DeRozan in exchange for Harrison Barnes and Duarte and some draft capital is enough to leap them into that top 3 conversation or put them above the OKCs, the Dallases, the Minnesotas of the world.
Well, here's the thing. I do think every season there is a surprise team, right? There's a team that you don't really see coming. And I think last season there were 2, really, because a lot of people had written off, or they were high on Anthony Edwards, but I don't think people thought that the Timberwolves were going to do what they did. And I think a lot of people were feeling like OKC was going to make a jump, but I don't think they thought that they were going to make this jump right now. So I think that all happened last season. Normally, you don't see 2 teams like that, and then you get the sleeper in the Mavericks come from the 5th seed and get to the finals. So going into next season, that surprise team could be the Grizzlies, I guess. But the Grizzlies, and I was just talking about this yesterday with the buddy Kyle, the Grizzlies are in a situation different yet similar to the Kings, to where, because the Grizzlies, and I know they added Zach Edey, but because the Grizzlies basically sold last season, right? Yeah. they don't necessarily know what they need. They got Zach Edey because they loved when they had Adams and they lost Adams. So the Grizzlies, I think they're going to be better, but a lot of people are saying the Grizzlies are going to just ball out. I think Ja Morant is a stud, but at the same time, the Grizzlies, they're basically just mobbing in with the same team that they had, because what additions can you make? And I know G.G. Jackson's super young as well, and he's got a really high ceiling, but they didn't make any additions because they didn't know what they needed, because they basically didn't have a season. So the same way last season, the Kings came in with the same exact thing for different reasons, the Grizzlies have as well. So the Grizzlies could be a surprise team, but yeah, surprise in maybe the fourth seed. I don't see the Grizzlies going back to a couple years ago when they were a 2-3 seed.
Well, let me take you back to last offseason when the Kings decided we're going to run it back with the Beam team, and they've earned a chance to defend what they did the year before and all that. The teams that made a leap, I felt, were relatively predictable. Oklahoma City making that leap, well, they added a fringe all-star in Chet Holmgren that they didn't have the year before. The Pelicans got back Zion Williamson after a year of being not healthy. The Timberwolves, despite the fact they made the playoffs in 2023, Karl Anthony Towns missed like 60 games during the season. And when Towns got reintegrated, they had the best defense in the NBA. Like, those were teams that we could relatively predict a development. And Dallas added Kyrie Irving midseason, fell apart. They got a full season to kind of work together, and Dallas ended up making that huge second half improvement that went on to the finals. Like, those were teams you could relatively see the improvement for, and the Kings got passed by 3 of those teams this past season. This offseason, I don't really see any pattern or rhyme or reason for what's going to happen next season. It's not like, oh, this team got substantially better and therefore they're going to jump the Kings, or the Warriors did not get better. The Rockets did not get better. You're banking on health for the Grizzlies, like you just said. And the Pelicans, yes, they added DeJounte Murray, but we have no idea whether Brandon Ingram is going to be on the team next year. So I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason for why a team should or shouldn't improve compared to where they were last year. And that's kind of that purgatory that a lot of these teams that are not named the Thunder, the Timberwolves, or the Mavericks are going to kind of exist in next year.
Coming up next, we have Jeff Young joining us, fan-sided editor for Round the Foghorn, talking a little bit of Giants. Are they going to sneak into the playoffs? And are we too hard on Farhan? After that, who's hot, who's not?